What New York looked like 300 years ago. If you walked through New York 300 years ago, you might not even recognize it. There were no skyscrapers, no subways, no traffic. Instead, you'd find muddy streets, wooden houses, farm animals wandering through town, and a small colonial port sitting at the edge of a vast wilderness. Yet even back then, this tiny settlement was already becoming something important. Ships arrived from Europe, merchants traded goods from across the Atlantic, and the foundations of one of the world's greatest cities were quietly being built. So what did New York really look like 300 years ago? Let's step back to the year 1700. New York was surprisingly small. Today, New York City has more than 8 million people. But around the year 1700, the entire city had only about 5,000 residents. That's smaller than many modern neighborhoods. Most of the town was concentrated on the southern tip of Manhattan. Above it stretched forests, farmland, and scattered villages. The northern part of Manhattan was mostly wilderness. In fact, if you traveled just a few miles north of the settlement, you could easily find yourself surrounded by trees, farms, and open land. New York wasn't a massive city yet. It was a small colonial port town. But it was growing, and its location made it incredibly important. The city had another name before. A few decades earlier, New York was not even called New York. It was known as New Amsterdam. The settlement had been founded by the Dutch at the beginning of the 17th century. Dutch merchants built the city as a trading center for the Dutch West India Company. But in 1664, everything changed. English warships appeared in the harbor. The Dutch surrendered, and the city was renamed New York in honor of the Duke of York. Although the English now controlled the colony, many Dutch traditions remained. Dutch-style houses, Dutch surnames, Dutch customs. New York's cultural mix had already begun, and that diversity would go on to define the city for centuries. What did people eat in colonial New York? If you walked through the markets of New York around the year 1700, the food you would see would be very different from today. Vendors filled their stalls with products brought from nearby farms, merchant ships, and small gardens around the town. There were fresh vegetables, corn, beans, pumpkins, salted meat that could last for weeks, and large pots where stews slowly cooked to feed entire families. But one of the most abundant foods in the city came directly from the water: oysters. Today, oysters are an expensive dish in many restaurants. But in 18th century New York, they were incredibly common. The harbor and rivers around Manhattan were filled with enormous oyster beds. There were so many that, according to some accounts, they literally covered parts of the shoreline. Vendors sold them in the markets. They were eaten fresh, roasted, or added to stews. For many residents of the city, oysters were one of the most accessible foods available. Another very common drink was cider or light beer, not just for taste, but because the city's water was not always safe to drink. So for many people in colonial New York, a typical meal could be quite simple: a bowl of hot stew, some salted meat, perhaps seasonal vegetables, and very likely, a few oysters from the harbor. The harbor was the heart of the city. If you visited New York in 1700, the most active place in the city was the harbor. Ships regularly arrived from Europe and the Caribbean. They carried goods such as sugar, rum, textiles, tools, and manufactured products. In return, merchants exported products from the colonies: furs, timber, agricultural products. The harbor turned New York into an important trading center. Dock workers loaded cargo. Sailors moved back and forth between taverns and ships. Merchants negotiated deals along the waterfront. The city was small, but its economy was already connected to the Atlantic world. The population was very diverse. Even in the year 1700, New York was already a surprisingly diverse place. People from many parts of the world lived there: English colonists, Dutch families, German immigrants, enslaved Africans, Native Americans trading with the colony. Languages mixed in the streets, cultures crossed. Markets sold products from across the Atlantic. This diversity would eventually become one of New York's most important characteristics. But even in its early colonial days, the city was already a meeting point of cultures. The streets were dirt roads. If you walked through New York in 1700, the first thing you would notice would be the streets. They were not paved. Most were simply dirt roads. After the rain, they turned into thick mud. Carts had difficulty moving forward. Horses left manure everywhere. And in the busiest areas, the streets could become very dirty very quickly. There were no streetlights. At night, the town became dark and quiet. People carried lanterns if they needed to move around after sunset. Compared to the bright and bustling New York of today, the city at night was almost completely silent. Life was active and noisy. Even though the town was small, daily life could be very active. Merchants shouted in the markets. Blacksmiths hammered metal in their workshops. Carpenters built new houses. Carts rolled through the streets carrying goods. Ships fired cannons when entering the harbor. And church bells marked the hours. Compared to modern New York, it was quieter. But for a colonial town, it was already a place full of movement. Opportunity attracted many people. Farmers, craftsmen, merchants. Many arrived hoping to build a better life in the colony. Taverns were everywhere. As in many colonial cities, taverns played a very important role in daily life. New York had many small taverns where people gathered after work. Inside you could find sailors, merchants, travelers, and local residents. People drank beer, rum, or cider. They exchanged news. They talked about politics, and sometimes argued about taxes, trade, or British authority. Many deals were made in these places. Rumors spread, and sometimes fights started. In many ways, taverns were the social center of the city. Slavery in New York. An important and often forgotten part of early New York's history is that slavery existed in the city. At the beginning of the 18th century, a significant part of the population was made up of enslaved Africans. In fact, at certain moments, nearly 1/5 of the city's residents were enslaved. Many worked inside the homes of wealthy colonists. Others worked on farms near the city. And many also worked inside the settlement itself, building roads, carrying goods, working on the docks of the harbor. New York was an important port within the Atlantic trade, and that also connected it to the system of slavery that existed in many colonies. Life for enslaved people was extremely harsh. They had no freedom, and their labor supported much of the colonial economy. Today, this part of New York's history is increasingly recognized as a fundamental part of the city's past, because although New York would eventually become a symbol of opportunity and diversity, its early growth was also marked by deep inequalities. The wall that gave Wall Street its name. In colonial New York, there was something that might surprise many people today. A wall. In the mid-17th century, when the settlement was still controlled by the Dutch, colonists built a wooden defensive wall along the northern edge of the town. They feared attacks from other European powers and possible conflicts with native groups. So they built a long barrier made of wood and earth. The wall crossed the island and marked the northern boundary of the settlement. Beyond that point, there was nature, fields, forests, and unknown territory. Over time, the wall lost its military importance, but the street that ran along it kept its name: Wall Street. Today, Wall Street is known around the world as the center of global finance. But its name has a much simpler origin. A wooden wall built centuries ago to protect a small colonial town. The city was growing quickly. Even in 1700, New York was already beginning to grow. More ships arrived every year. More merchants settled in the harbor. Trade expanded, and new buildings appeared along the waterfront. During the following century, the population would increase dramatically. The streets would expand. The city would grow northward, and the small colonial town would begin to transform into a great city. The foundations of modern New York were already being built. The New York we see today. If you walk through New York today, it is hard to imagine what this place looked like 300 years ago. Towering skyscrapers, bright lights, millions of people moving through the streets. But 300 years ago, this was a small colonial port. A place of muddy roads, wooden houses, sailing ships, and noisy markets. Much of that early New York has disappeared. Fires, rebuilding, and centuries of growth completely transformed the city. But beneath the modern skyline, that history still exists. Buried under layers of streets, buildings, and time, because every great city begins somewhere. And New York began as a small settlement on the edge of the Atlantic world. A place that would eventually become one of the most influential cities on the planet. If you enjoyed exploring what New York was really like 300 years ago, I hope you enjoyed this journey through the past. This video is part of a series on the channel where we explore what places around the world looked like centuries ago. So if you enjoy discovering how cities and places have changed through history, feel free to subscribe and join the journey, because here we explore the world. From then to now.